Hello, I'm Michael Mayer from VocalWisdom.com, and this is the next episode of the VocalWisdom.com Masterclass series. In this episode, we're going to talk about resonance. I have an individual who wrote to me with a question asking if I could elaborate on resonance. Her question goes on to say, some people say you should try to imagine the voice being forward behind the teeth, while others emphasize that the only thing that's essential for resonance to appear is an open throat in the back. Which is more important from my perspective to keep the resonance present at all times? And then the second part to the question was, she recently found a description of singing that stated basically that it's not about singing lower or higher, but more shallow or deep as far as what the sensations are in the mouth. So for example, it referred to places where acoustic waves are reflected in the mouth. Low sounds are reflected on the hard palate closer to the teeth, and the higher you sing, the sounds gradually move more towards the soft palate. And she asks if that's something that I teach people, singers, to imagine that happening, and if I find that helpful. So resonance is I think a lot of things are misunderstood, and I think resonance is one of them. I always like to say, okay, let's start from some kind of definition so that we know what we're talking about when we talk about resonance. So what is resonance? The way I generally define resonance is air that is vibrating sympathetically to a sound source. And in our case, it's a vibrating material. So the sound source is the vibrating of the vocal cords. Resonance is the sympathetic vibration of the air in the vocal tract in response to that sound source. I always use the example of stringed instruments, for instance, like an acoustic guitar. The resonance of the acoustic guitar is the air inside the body of the guitar vibrating sympathetically to the vibration of the strings. And so the thing that we need to recognize is that the resonance is basically the tone that we hear. We don't hear the vibration really, and I think that's partly why people tend to be more focused on resonance than really on the vibration, because the resonance is the tone, and we kind of experience it when we listen to somebody else. We experience that the tone has dimension, where the vibration is kind of not something we perceive. Both as the singer, we barely perceive it unless we might notice the sensation of buzzing down here. But in general, we don't really notice it, so we don't naturally think of it. We do perceive the resonance in terms of, because we can kind of associate that with the size and the shape that we're making in how we're pronouncing hi-yo. And also when we watch somebody else, we see their mouth form, and we can kind of imagine, the sound has this dimensions to it, and where vibration is kind of something that we don't really notice. So because of that, I think we get a little distracted from what the whole situation is. And so, like I always talk about, we need to make sure we remember all of the components that are involved. And when it comes to the sound itself, the breathing isn't really directly related to the sound. Breathing is one of the three main components, but breathing relates more to feeding the vibration. I think that's a topic for a different class, but that's part of why breathing tends to get overdone, is because people notice the resonance and they notice the breathing, and they kind of forget about the vibration. So they go from the breath to the resonance, and they kind of overpower the voice. So resonance, which is what we're talking about here today, I think it's really important that we remember that resonance is directly related to vibration. So how the voice vibrates, how effectively, how efficiently the voice vibrates is going to determine the effectiveness and the efficiency and the clarity of the resonance. So you have a couple key elements that determine the resonance. One is the effectiveness of the vibration, and one is the effectiveness of the form. And when I say form, it's the form that we create with our jaw, mouth, or another way of thinking is the form we create in our pronunciation. I talk a lot about acoustic pronunciation. That's the way that I think of pronouncing in order to really maximize the acoustic effectiveness of our vocal tract, which is also resonance. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about form. So form, because we've talked about vibration in other classes. So since we've talked about vibration in other classes, let's go over that real quick and just kind of, check that off the list. So resonance is determined by essentially the two components, the two elements of vibration and form. It's the combination of those two. Form is a little bit more involved, so I'm going to do that second. Vibration, like we keep talking about, vibration needs to be pure, not loose and leaking unvocalized breath, I guess the way we would put it. If the more breath that's going through the vibration, the less acoustic response naturally there will be. And so then that's why we have to kind of force the voice to work harder to be louder. If we have a nice pure vibration like we're always talking about, there will be more natural resonance. If we if we're just kind of like that, we let the vibration be loose, there's not really much resonance there, so then we're going to be tempted to have to overwork the voice more in order to make the same, really not actually the same amount of sound, but what at least is a comparable amount of sound. So that's why the vibration is so important, because the vibration creates the acoustic response that we identify as resonance. Now the form, that's the part where we actually sort of are dealing with the resonance. We can form in a lot of various ways, and ideally we want to try to narrow that range of possibilities down to some kind of a form that is going to act as an acoustic chamber, I guess, would be a way of putting it. If you think about this concept relative to other musical instruments, the ones that we can really clearly identify the resonant aspects of it, the resonant values, we will notice that there's generally some sort of a enclosure. Now, a lot of woodwind instruments not necessarily are obviously an enclosure because there may be a longer tube, for instance, like a clarinet, or horns of many types. The long coils we see in a trumpet and trombone and things like that. But essentially it has the effect of being an enclosed, that's a lot of empty space that's all enclosed until you from one end to the other. Guitars, stringed instruments are enclosed in the body with small openings. The F holes in the violins and cellos, and the sound hole of a guitar. A general guitar, you have a sound hole like this, and then you have a body that's this big. So there's a lot of empty space in there with a limited exposure to the outside air. So that enclosed space has an acoustic effect. that I started calling the cave effect. It's like when you go into a cave, and like the sound of a water drop falling into a puddle is like very, very prominent, you know. Or just when you speak, even if you speak quietly, it just seems like the whole area just wakes up, because that enclosed space really is very efficient at utilizing the sound energy and becoming excited by it, being energized by it. So for our purposes, with our instrument of the voice, we're talking about the vocal tract. And the vocal tract is kind of a combination of the tube that we see in woodwind instruments, because it's kind of long and thin, long and skinny, you know, from the larynx up through the airway to the mouth. And also we do include the up here through the nasal passages too, in that system. There's also a little bit of cave effect in the way we can form our mouth. So most of the vocal tract is fairly, well, I was going to say it's fairly fixed, and for the most part it's fairly fixed, although it does have the potential to constrict. It has the potential to shorten by having the larynx be in a higher position. So if you observe yourself swallow, you can feel the larynx go up in order to close off the airway. And obviously the whole purpose of that is to be able to kind of squeeze the food or the liquid down to the stomach and not go into the airway. So that airway closes off in order for us to swallow. So the larynx is mobile, and it can go up and down. And so when we talk about a low larynx, it should be referring to this position of it being the opposite of the closing of the swallow. So having that released down is going to give us access to more of the full dimensions of the vocal tract, which is going to improve the resonance. If the vocal tract is shorter, it's going to be limiting the amount of resonance potential there is in the system. And so that's going to have a negative effect on that, at least in terms of, especially in terms of resonance. So that's a big piece of variability. But probably the biggest piece of variability in the resonance system is the combination of, there's the mouth, the jaw and the lips. That combination can give us so many various forms. And in one sense, that's really important, because that's how we pronounce so many different sounds in order to create language. And obviously singing in general almost always involves language in pronouncing words. So we have to find, that's why I always emphasize acoustic pronunciation, because we do want to pronounce so that we can be understood. And a lot of times that's a difficult thing to accomplish. If you listen to a wide selection of singers, there will be plenty of singers that you can't really understand what they're saying. That's partly because of resonance. It's mostly because of vibration, and so that's not quite part of the topic here for this class. But ideally, we want to be able to understand what's being said. And so we have to learn how to pronounce so that we maximize the acoustic energy through resonance, through effective resonance, but at the same time don't distort the pronunciation so that we can be understood. So that's kind of our guiding principle, because and really, if we do this right, we should be able to do both of those things. We should be able to create that combination, and good pronunciation should actually give us our best resonance also. So they should not be exclusive to each other. But taking this idea of the mouth, lips, jaw, this combination that's so variable, how do we deal with that? Well, the way that I always try to work is from this idea of creating a musical instrument. And so there is sort of an optimal condition that we can kind of try to find. And what I always try to do is sort of think about finding that vocal tract and finding the natural length of it. And you hear people talk about various vowel forms, maybe do more O or AW, aw. And these are true to a certain, these are true. They're not necessarily the way that I feel is most effective to accomplish what we're trying to do. But it's a helpful reminder, definitely, because a lot of people, including myself, have the tendency to kind of gravitate a little bit too much to a talking position. And that would be more like, ah, eh. And there's not quite enough enclosure to create the cave effect that I call it, which is good resonance. And it creates what is more technically called a closed acoustic, where when this is too open, ah, that's a more open acoustic quality. And if we go even more open, ah, we start getting what's called white tone. White meaning lacking color. Ah, and or spread. Ah, if we really exaggerate it even more. So we want to kind of figure out how we can kind of stay more towards the other direction. And so I always kind of think about the corners of the lips staying a little bit more in and slightly forward. Ah, ah. And so the reason I don't instruct through changing the vowel, like saying O or aw, AW, is because I want to still be able to say whatever vowel I'm saying. So I'm still saying ah in my mind and inside, but I'm creating an acoustic environment that I can say ah in that is also ah more contained. So I'm thinking of saying ah like father, ah, but I'm bringing this into a little bit longer sort of condition so that it keeps more of a containment to the sound energy, containment to the acoustic energy, and gives us that more of that closed acoustic environment that is going to amplify and reinforce the sound of the voice much more effectively. And what happens when we do that is it takes a lot of the burden off the vibration. So it makes vocalizing easier, even though we're actually producing more sound. So it's a really nice way of taking advantage of the acoustic potential of our voice. And that's what, that's also what we hear when we hear a good singer. We hear what we might term a professional sound, right? Where we hear, ah, it sounds kind of amateurish, probably young or something. But when we get that more contained and ah, ah, the throat's more released, ah, 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 it sounds richer and more colorful. Well, we usually think of that as being a more mature, a more professional sort of sound. Now, it's not the sound that we're trying to do, it's the coordination of the instrument. That's what I always try to emphasize. The sound is just a result. And that leads us into sort of the second part of the question, where she was describing learning about using the sensations of the kind of the position of the acoustic waves inside the mouth, and using those to kind of be targets. And this is a common idea. There's some famous pedagogues that have kind of emphasized or encouraged this sort of thing. But this is, again, for me, this is a result. This isn't a cause, this is a result. And so we can notice it. I have no problem with that. But when you start to try to do it, it usually falls short, because the cause isn't the sound waves striking more forward. the result is that because of the low pitch. So it's when you do ah, and it also depends on the vibration being efficient. If the vibration is ha ha ha, then trying to create that result when you don't have a good condition of the source vibration, then is going to cause us to create tensions or excesses, or various kinds of imbalances that are going to eventually cause us trouble and get confused. So the feeling of being more forward on the hard palate when singing low, and then kind of feeling more in the soft palate when you sing high, I don't even know if those are really those are accurate sensations. They may be sensations that somebody notices, but I would never encourage somebody to try to create those sensations, because again, they're results and they're really just illusions. Lamperti talks about that in the Vocal Wisdom book of notes of his teaching. These sensations, they have value, but ultimately they're illusions. They're sensations of energy that we notice, that we perceive, and they can kind of give us some confirmation. And that's what he said is that they can be helpful to confirm whether we're doing things effectively or not, but we certainly shouldn't try to make a technique or a method out of them. What's much more reliable is to depend on good coordination, breathing, good form, and then good vibration. And some techniques that I do use are the things that I do are for the purpose of kind of conditioning ourselves to a different, I guess I would call, behavior, right? How we pronounce, we can kind of consider that a behavior. And so if we're used to pronouncing, like for instance myself, if we're more accustomed to pronouncing a little bit more shallow, and a little bit more thin or white or forward, a, e, o, u, then we have to sort of condition ourselves to pronounce a different way so that we make sure that we do get the resonance value that is natural to our voice, that we just out of habit neglect. So for instance, condition ourselves to get used to getting that feeling, and not and being too shallow, and which ends up sounding thinner. One of the tools I use is to make a W sound. Wah wah wah, wah 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 wah. Because when you say wah, it brings your lips forward, and that's something that that tends to be actually kind of a difficult thing to do, especially like if you're saying or a. You're not likely to naturally do that. So doing wah wah wah, we, wah we, e too, e. So it just helps keep that. I think of these lips as being sort of soft and relaxed forward. Some people have referred to this as being sort of pouty, which is fine. Whatever description helps you remember to do it is all that matters. It's not quite trumpety like some people do. So you have to kind of feel what's balanced, what's effective, and you got to feel when it might be exaggerated. So what I like to do is do wah 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 wah, and feel that those relaxed lips. Lamperti referred to this as flowering of the lips, so the lips feel like a flower, but not so much that they're distorting and creating some sort of negative reflex in the throat. All right. So, and we also don't want them to be totally flat. So anytime the corners of the lips, kind of the rule of thumb I go by is I watch out for the corners of the lips going out. And I always want the corners of the lips to go slightly in. In order for the and this is also a helpful thing, in order for the corners of the lips to go in, the jaw has to get open a little bit. That's another problem that I think a lot of people tend to have. I certainly did, is a difficulty in opening the jaw. We tend to keep the jaw too closed. Now, part of the reason I think is kind of the gut instinct that if they open the mouth, they're going to be spread. And that's because they're not accustomed to forming with the lips. So if you put them together, then we can get a pretty good balance in the acoustics. So feeling that wah, wah, wah. And you don't even have to say the W, but kind of a way, like a kind of a sequence that you can practice this on is to do wah, 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 and feel how much to open it, not going wah, 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 but feel some of that W feeling staying, like you don't open past this far. Wah, 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 but not wah, 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 wah. Or keep the corners of the lips in. When you go to the ah, wah, keep the corners in the W position and just let the lips come open. Wah, and don't let the corners of the lips release out. Wah, wah. And then practice just saying ah, but you just think the feeling of the W. Ah, and then for instance, as you sing higher, you can feel, see the problem as you sing higher is that the acoustic gets more open. Ah, and that when you try to go into the high voice, then that will be even bigger of a problem. So what this can help with is to kind of imagine. You can practice actually doing the W, and then graduate to just thinking the W. Now this is similar to what a lot of people try to do by thinking of mixing in a little bit of O or oo or something else, but and that's fine if that works for somebody, that's fine. But this is the way that I work, and I find it helpful to kind of feel that so that you're not, I don't like to use the vowel. I want to think of this as the acoustic form, and then I say the vowel is always still pure, so that you're not thinking of the vowel as being because then when you sing a vowel in the text of your song, now things start to get confused because you're singing, for instance, A, but okay, wait a minute. Now, but do I mix in some AW? So now I'm singing A with aw, but your brain isn't thinking clearly, and that starts to weaken the natural reflexes. So I always want to be pronouncing a clear vowel, and then the form is the acoustics of the musical instrument, which is not necessarily pronunciation. I mean, it is, but I don't think of it that way. I think of it as these are the vowels I'm saying, ah, a, e, o, u, and then I have the acoustic form, and then I pronounce the vowel inside that acoustic form, so that there's sort of different, so that you don't change the other side of that situation is you don't want to change the acoustic form for the vowel. So you have a good acoustic form on ah, ah, e, o. You want to feel ah, e, that you can pronounce clearly regardless of the acoustic form. You want to feel like you can keep a good acoustic form regardless of what you're pronouncing. Okay, so that's the way that I have kind of gradually developed the ways that I deal with those challenges. So hopefully that can be helpful to you. Though that's my discussion at this point about resonance. There's obviously could be much more to be said, but I think that's a pretty thorough sort of overview or beginning discussion about it. I think the key points are find that that acoustic form that gives you more of a complete cave effect, like that echoing, right? That's another way of thinking of acoustic energy and resonance, is that it's an echoing of the primary sound. So it's not just but and so practice finding that form, and notice how, even though I have this nice contained form that gives more richness and color to the tone, it shouldn't sound like the vowel itself is distorted. It shouldn't sound like so the vowel, the clarity of the vowel is very dependent on the clarity of the vibration. So that we can't just focus on one thing. We have to learn to coordinate all of the elements so that they're being as effective and efficient as possible. Okay, so I think that's good. If there's any questions, please leave them in the comments at the blog page. And I hope this was helpful and answered the question and gave you gave everybody else some new things to think about. Okay, so we'll see you next time. Thanks.